Hello. This first video today will examine some of the causes for war. We will specifically focus on different levels of analysis, offensive and defensive realist explanations for the causes of war, particularly the security dilemma, and then balance of power explanations for the causes of war. But first, we have to look at different levels of analysis. As you probably know, when we look at international relations, we have different ways of looking at about how states interact and how states behave. The three major levels of analysis that we focus on are the system, the state, and the individual. And in the two videos that you receive for this lesson, we will look at different system, state, and individual explanations for the causes of war. The system level essentially argues that the characteristics or different characteristics of the international system forces states to behave in certain ways. We know from realist theory that the core variable or key thing we have to understand is the level of relative power within the system. When that power changes, then the chances of war increase or decrease. On the state level, we look at state characteristics and how they influence the likelihood of war. There are many different characteristics we can examine. They can include the nature of the state, for example, whether the state is a democracy or a dictatorship. There are some theories out there that suggest that democratic states are more peaceful than autocratic states, for example. We can look at whether a state is weak or strong. Do strong states, are they more peaceful or are they more prone to war? There are other factors too. These can include the location of the state. Do states that live in dangerous neighborhoods, such as France or Germany or Russia, bordered by many countries, behave differently than states that are living in relatively benign neighborhoods? For example, how does the fact that the US is bordered by two allies, Mexico and Canada, affect how they understand the international system and their own security? And on the state level, we can always talk about culture and history. How do states and the culture of states affect how they understand war and international relations? For example, some have argued that the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 fits within US strategic culture. Or in other words, the US has a missionary quality to its foreign policy, and that there is an innate drive to transform the world in its own image, or a fundamental belief in the superiority of its own system, and that US foreign policy will always pursue that goal because that's an innate part of US culture. Obviously, this is quite a controversial theory. Then we have the individual level. They include the role of leaders, security elites, sometimes people and populations. We can use that to explain World War II, for example. Hitler's role in driving the path of Nazi Germany, or the end of the Cold War and how Gorbachev manipulated or influenced events within the Soviet Union. The individual characteristics of each leader. If you look at George Bush's response to 9/11, how different would the US response have been if there was a democratic leader in office? Now, each of these levels have different weaknesses and strengths. The system level often gives you a very, very wide view, but there is little detail. And many people criticize it for not being specific enough or not being in the weeds or too general. The state level can often be quite comprehensive, but lacks a broad overview and requires a lot of work in order to get general characteristics or kind of generalizable theories. And then on the individual level, this problem is magnified. There is a lot of detail, but there's very little ability to create a bigger picture. Of course, there are other levels. These can include the organizational level, people that look at the nature of bureaucracy and how bureaucracies drive foreign security policy and even war. You could even look at the economic level, for example, Marxist theory. So there are different ways of looking at it, but the major three are the system, the state, and the individual. So the first cause of war we're going to look at is the security dilemma. And this is very common. You might have dealt with it already, but it's worth going over. This comes from defensive realism. Now we know that in defensive realism, or defensive realists that argue that states seek security, but they do not seek to maximize their power, because the maximizing of power or the desire to become a hegemon is ultimately self-defeating. So what states should do is arm enough or build up enough power to secure their own interests. Or in other words, arm for defensive purposes. The problem with this is that while you may be arming for your own defense, the other state may view this as offensive because there is no trust in the international system. So as you see in this picture, you see an American president almost building missile defense systems because it will secure him. But as a response, Russia views those missile defense systems as threatening and builds more weapons to respond. So your insecurity leads states to arm, but that arming can make other states insecure and can often lead to a security spiral which can end in war. Now this matrix, which is created by an IR theorist called Robert Jervis, goes into more detail. Often people that look at the security dilemma focus on the offensive-defensive balance. When does offense have the advantage? When does defense have the advantage? How distinguishable are offensive capabilities from defensive capabilities? And in this matrix, it comes up with a formula for when the security dilemma is intense or less intense. So in this argument, when offensive measures are indistinguishable from defensive measures, so offensive weapons, for example, are basically look the same as defensive weapons, and for whatever reason offense has the advantage, the security dilemma is doubly dangerous. This can lead to intense arms racing and virtually no international cooperation. And some would argue this might have been the case during the nuclear arms race during the Cold War. However, in the case when offensive measures are indistinguishable from defensive measures and defense has the advantage, there will be a security dilemma, but because defense has the advantage, there is less desire to attack, and therefore some sort of security cooperation may be possible, and even security desires may be compatible, and therefore the world is relatively stable, although there is some sort of form of security dilemma. When offensive measures are distinguishable from defensive measures, or in other words, when you can tell the difference between offensive capabilities and defensive capabilities, and offense has the advantage, there is no security dilemma because we know the difference between the two capabilities, but obviously aggression is still possible, particularly if a status quo or revisionist state is out there, sees the potential advantage of offensive action and decides to take advantage of that. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. And then, when offensive measures are distinguishable from defensive measures, so the weaponry is clearly defensive on both sides, and defense has the advantage, so there is little desire to attack, then the world becomes doubly stable. So this is the matrix that determines the offensive-defensive dilemma, or security dilemma. And we are arguably witnessing a number of security dilemmas right now in the contemporary world. In this picture, you see Kim Jong-un with his celebrating the launch of a nuclear-capable missile. On the right of that picture, you see Iranian forces showing off their missile capabilities. In both cases, you can make an argument that there is a security dilemma occurring. North Korea can arguably be saying to be nuclear arming to defend itself, but clearly the US and South Korea and Japan and the rest of the world view this as an offensive and destabilizing measure and are arming to respond to this. This is provoking a response from North Korea. So we are becoming into a security spiral. In the Iranian case, there seemed to have been a solution with the Iranian nuclear deal, but some viewed that as not workable, particularly in the US, and so you could re-enter a security dilemma situation where both the US and Iran view each other as potential aggressors. In the bottom left, you see the show-off of a Chinese naval fleet surrounding its first aircraft carrier. Again, the US is viewing China's arming as a threat and are responding in kind, so we are now seeing the start of a new security dilemma in East Asia. And then on the bottom right, there's a picture of a Russian hypersonic missile test. In the West and NATO's point of view, Russian hypersonic capabilities are clearly a threat. But for Russia, they would argue that they are merely responding to increased NATO and US missile defense capabilities. So security dilemma is occurring there. So it's extremely important that we understand how states view each other and why they are pursuing these capabilities in order to avoid war. Of course, on the other side of offensive realism, we have the problem of security competition. Offensive realists argue that states will always seek to maximize their power. Not just their security, but seek to maximize their power, and they will do that through conquest if possible. Now, they argue that in most of history, the aggressive party ends up gaining the benefit. And therefore, when war occurs, it arises from this competition for power maximization. However, defensive realists argue that this is an illogical course because in major cases, the countries that have sought this level of power have been pushed back by the rest of the world. And they have these examples now. Napoleonic France, for example, or Nazi Germany went and sought to maximize their power through conquest and were ultimately defeated by balancing coalitions. Some in the US argue that China is now seeking to maximize its power, particularly in East Asia, and that the US has to respond by increasing cooperation with its allies, by increasing by providing arms to its allies and increasing its own military presence in East Asia, leading to the possibility of a war arising from this kind of this desire to seek power maximization. And certainly Russia would argue that NATO expansion was just another form of power maximization, seeking to exploit the weaknesses of Russia following the end of the Cold War. NATO expanded into their territory, seeking to maximize its power and creating the possibility of conflict arising from that. Another cause of war arising from kind of the system level of thought is the balance of power. Now, in your previous courses, you've almost certainly learned about this. The balance of power says that states will seek equilibrium in the international balance of power and will seek to avoid hegemonic dominance. How do they do this? They do this through internal balancing. Internal balancing mainly means procuring their own arms. And we saw this during the Cold War, nuclear arms race. Great powers building arms to balance each other. And then you can also build a system of alliances. The United Kingdom, for example, sought to balance the power of any major state on continental Europe in the 19th century by creating a system of alliances to counteract that major power. Hence, the United Kingdom had a number of different allies depending on the power context on the European continent. After the end of World War II, the European states sought to balance the rising power of the Soviet Union by forming an alliance with the US in the form of NATO. And then in the contemporary world, we're looking at Asia, and we are seeing China's rising power and the US seeking to balance that power by developing or advancing its own alliances in the region, although they are struggling because there is now a new dynamic within the balance of power, or arguably a new dynamic within the balance of power, and that is economic power and political power. So how do you balance China militarily when all of your allies are economically dependent on China for economic success and prosperity? So this is the challenge of the contemporary world. But the reason why we're talking of balance of power is because of the concept of polarity. Now, polarity is a discussion about the number of great powers within the system and how they seek balance. And there are three different terms for polarity: multipolarity, bipolarity, and unipolarity. Now, multipolarity describes a situation when there are three or more great powers in the international system. In this context, those powers are seeking to balance each other. They do so by building their own weapons, but importantly, they also do so by creating alliances with smaller countries. So in this system, what smaller powers do, small and medium powers do, in relation to the great powers is extremely important, because maintaining balance is everything. So in 18th century to the early 20th century Europe, you had a number of great powers. France, for example, Russia, Austro-Hungary, United Kingdom, and they were all shifting their allies, trying to attract allies or getting allies to defect from the other great power in order to change the balance. So Kenneth Waltz, the man who came up with the concept, or one of the guys who came up with the concept of polarity and war, would argue that in a multipolar system, because there is so much uncertainty about what the smaller powers are doing and whether the system is balanced or not, war is more likely. It is an unstable system because balancing is constant. The second concept, bipolarity, talks about two great powers or two poles within the international system that dominate everything around them. Now, the argument here is this creates relative stability. Under this system, the two great powers can internally balance themselves, and they do not require allies in any real way. Therefore, even if all the allies shifted, or all the small powers shifted to one side, bipolarity still exists, or balance still exists, because the other two states, or the two states on top, are so strong. The only historical example of this happening was the Cold War, when you had the US on one side and the USSR on the other side. Because of nuclear weapons and internal balancing, those two states could survive and be dominant without the help of their allies. Allies were useful, of course, to operate on the periphery and on the fringes and to assist, but ultimately survival was not dependent on the role of small powers, and therefore things were relatively stable. The states could understand the US and USA and the USSR could balance themselves. So they were not too afraid of changes in the system. And then, of course, at the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union collapsed. And every state in the world was weak except for one, which is the paradox. And it became unipolarity, or the unipolar moment, where the United States became the most dominant power in the international system. This, according to structural realists, meant the system was fundamentally unbalanced, and that eventually a state would rise to challenge the USA because the system cannot allow one state to remain dominant for long. Now, why this took so long has been the question for many realists, and they're trying to still think about this. Some of the argument is the US, despite being the hegemon or the most powerful actor, acted generally in a benign manner, thereby discouraging balancing behavior. But arguably, as we're seeing with China and other states, countries are beginning to try and balance US power again. So which type of system we have affects the level or possibility of war starting. In a multipolar system, according to structural realists, the chances of war are higher because of constant balancing, things become unstable. In a bipolar system, if we reach bipolarity without war starting, then the system will regain stability. In a unipolar moment, the system is quite stable in one way because you have one superpower, but then you have a number of rising powers coming up to balancing, and then things become uncertain. And this is the question that is dominating much of the academic discourse today. Particularly, what type of polarity are we going to see in the contemporary and the future world? We understand that the United States is a declining great power. Now, when we say declining, we mean declining relative to other states. However, some in the US and in Europe will still argue that the US is the world's only superpower, depending on how you measure it. Others have argued the middle ground, that the world has entered a new era of bipolarity, with the US on one side and China on the other. This is because the US and China are so much more powerful than the next actors in the system, namely India, Russia, Germany, the United Kingdom. So no one can touch them. Therefore, we have now entered a bipolar moment. And if that's the case, the question is, will it be stable bipolarity, as Wohl suggests, or is something else happening? And then finally, you have many arguing that we are entering a multipolar world. The US declining, China rising, but a number of other countries rising as well. Russia, which is weak but has nuclear weapons. India, with so much potential. Japan, possibly. Indonesia. The European Union as a security actor. And if this is the case, in a multipolar world, we will see changes in system behavior which may increase or affect the possibility of war. Thank you.